Namta, will you give us a heads up? Maybe on your camera?
Yes, Aishwarya, you can begin.
Good evening to one and all present here. On behalf of Kamla Raheja Vidyanidhi Institute for Architecture and Environmental Studies, I extend a warm welcome to each one of you to be a part of the Kamla Raheja Memorial Lecture Series 2021, supported by the Kamla Raheja Foundation. The event is organized as a 3-day event starting today and will be majorly anchored by the keynote lecture, the director's talk, the dissertation colloquium, and the KRVIA elective exhibition. Each segment of the KRMLS is envisioned to align with the broader intent of the Institute, the making of the Apocalypse Manifesto. We look forward to your presence and participation through this event, as we believe it will not only contribute to the overall discourse of architecture as a discipline, but also open up numerous possibilities and avenues for further inquiry. Without further ado, it gives me great honor to invite to this forum Director of KRVIA, Mr. Manoj Parmar, who will commemorate this event. Over to you, Manoj.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Good evening to students, faculties, colleagues, and speakers. On behalf of Upnagar Shikshan Mandal, KRVI, I welcome you all to Kamla Raheja Memorial Lecture Series supported by Kamla Raheja Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome Ola Bowman and Prem Chandavarkar on KRMLS Lecture Series 2021. KRMLS is a platform for newer imagination as well as introspection into our past endeavors, so both of them simultaneously. This year, theme on the Apocalypse Manifesto is an audacious attempt to question the relationship between philosophy and architecture, spanning between critical examination of an avant-garde endeavors to the social and politics of architecture. To me, it is an outstanding theoretical plunge into scholastic and polemic of architectural manifestos. The theme attempts to challenge the metaphorical thread between architecture and philosophy that has prevailed in intellectual tradition of architectural manifestos. With this, I would like to invite Shirish Joshi to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Manoj. Our respondent today will be Prem Chandavarkar. Prem is the managing partner at CNT Architects, an award-winning and widely published architectural practice based in Bangalore. He received his training at School of Planning and Architecture and University of Oregon in the America. He is a former executive director of Sriti Manipal Institute of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore, and currently a member of the Board of Architecture, Culture and Spirituality Forum in USA. He is an academic advisor and guest faculty at Indian and International Colleges of Architecture. Besides his practice at CNT, he writes, lectures and blogs on architecture, urbanism, philosophy, politics, education, environment, art and cultural studies. Thank you, Prem, for joining us. And our speaker today is the founder director of Design Society, the new design museum and platform in Shenzhen. In a recent article titled The Solipsism of Architecture, Ola Bowman lists 6 points absolutely required for a revolution in architecture and ends with a scathing attack on our beloved epigram, architecture or revolution, with an inversion, architecture can be avoided. Ola Bowman, in his past roles, has been the editor-in-chief of the Volume magazine, which he co-founded with OMA and Columbia University. He was also the director of Netherlands Architecture Institution and has worked as a curator of Manifesta 3 and curated national pavilions at Biennales of Shenzhen, Sao Paulo, and Venice. He was creative director of the Urbanism and Architecture Bi-City Biennale in Shenzhen. His publications include The Invisible in Architecture, Ubiquitous China, Architecture of Consequence, Design Society, The Making of a New Creative Platform. Ola has taught architecture and design at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the University of Hong Kong. In 2018, he received the Shenzhen Creative Influencer Award. I welcome Ola. You can take over from here. Thanks, Ola.
Thank you very much, Shirish. And thank you also, Manoj, for hosting this event, and Prem Chandavakar for being respondent today. And thank you for the invitation to Rohan Shivkumar. Really great to be here with you. It's a great honor to give this lecture for the KRVA VIA community. I must say that speaking in India virtually brings back lots of memories I'm very fond of. Memories of experiencing architecture in India, and even some intense life experiences that I happened to go through in India. I remember, for instance, a lecture tour through Chennai, Kolhapur, Pune, Mumbai, Delhi, Bangalore, which was a wonderful intellectual, inspiring adventure for me, meeting so many people in the audiences, having great conversations that I will never forget. I remember a Tata housing workshop with Tata Foundation on new affordable housing typologies as we collaborated with KRVA several years ago. I remember, for instance, a visit to the countryside house of Shirish Biri, the architect, which was really a wonderful visit. I remember a ceremony to receive the Architecture and Design magazine and Sarah Awards Golden Award in Delhi. I remember vivid conversations with Surabh Gupta in Noida, near Delhi, about founding a new design village, so to speak, which I think happened eventually. I remember amazing visits to cities like Leh in Ladakh, or Uti, or Chandigarh, obviously, and so much more. So it's really a great honor and big pleasure to be back in Mumbai, albeit through Microsoft Teams, which is, of course, in the end, also a great pity. I do that in a way by perhaps sharing with you one of the most universal discourses that I happen to develop in my working career as critic and curator, and I'm happy to do so with you. So I would like to start sharing my slides, which is here. Can you help me with sharing?
Yeah, you are already sharing, Ola.
Okay. So then I can go to my own screen with the slides. I guess you can hear me. So
yes,
I would like to start.
if you could go full screen.
So full screen.
Yeah, I think you'll have to share your entire desktop like we've done yesterday.
Is it full screen now?
No, it's still the PowerPoint window.
That's in my case, it's full screen.
I think you'll have to reshare, stop sharing and start sharing again, but this time select the entire desktop, the first thumbnail.
This is better?
Not yet. No, Ola, when you click share content, right? You'll have to select the leftmost thumbnail, which says desktop. That way we'll be able to see your full screen.
So I share again?
Yes.
And then? So I can...
Yes, when you hit share content, the leftmost thumbnail that you see, which says entire desktop or screen number 1 or something.
There are several screens at the bottom of the screen, and I can
yes,
select.
the one on the left. Yes, the one on the extreme left.
Is this better?
Perfect. I think now when you go full screen, we'll be able to see the whole thing. Yes, yes, perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's start with the name of the lecture series that I have the privilege to open with this keynote, the Apocalypse Manifesto. I think it's a wonderful title. It brings some references to mind, but let's take it at face value. Then I would say it's a kind of oxymoron, if you ask me, because if any manifesto can make a difference, eventually and ultimately, it could prevent the apocalypse to happen. If it doesn't make the difference, we are not sure whether we have to go through it. So there is a kind of interesting reflexive dimension already in this title, and I hope to justify that in the course of the speech. At least I could say the mission of the talk is to prevent the apocalypse to happen by way of the manifesto which is inside. And let me make a few other remarks about the setting, the context of this event. First of all, the purpose of the lecture series, as I read it in your paperwork, and I will quote, the Apocalypse Manifesto as part of the Kamla Raheja Memorial Lecture Series shall sketch out the trajectories of possible future directions for architecture and consequently architecture education. And I think that's an interesting order of things already. And actually, I may start with a slight criticism to that order of things. Because if indeed we are heading for something close to apocalypse, let's say a very serious global and cultural and even biological situation as we face today, you could say that architecture has played a role in allowing that to happen. Architecture is not innocent. Architecture has been contributing to that urgent situation by its own very own practice. And as we all know, it's always very difficult such a cause to become part of the solution at the same time. How can you solve a crisis if you are a contributor to that same crisis? And in a way, you could say that if we need a new concept of architecture, a new substance of architecture, maybe education itself, maybe the architectural pedagogy can help us to guide us out and to lead us to a new practice away from the pitfalls of architecture as we know so well from the past. Actually, the pitfalls of architecture that we are still training ourselves in, that we still pass on as to new generations of designers. Just to mention a few of those pitfalls. For instance, there is a kind of attitude, a kind of habit in working with clients. The client-designer relationship is full of pitfalls. Things taken for granted, certain givens that could be challenged at the level of education right away. The way money flows in architecture, the way the business case of architecture is defined, the way architects are shackling themselves to the boundaries of a specific building site and do all their things, do, let's say, do all the tricks of architecture within the boundaries of the building site. The irresponsible programs that we know sometimes architects have to materialize in spatial design. The very notion of a building as the ultimate medium of architecture, is that something inevitable, or can that also be seen as a pitfall that we can go beyond to? And even the narrow definition of the word architect is such a pitfall that we can challenge in a new way. So all these pitfalls, all these things may inhibit architecture from doing the necessary thing, the essential, the urgent. And schools could be the ideal ground, maybe playground, for experimenting with different constitutions of architecture. So if I go back to the title, Finding Measure in Architecture, as it has been published in the publicity materials that you shared, I see a slight error in the interpretation of my title. I defined my title first of all as Finding Measure by Architecture, not in architecture. In a way, it's already kind of a limitation to the potential of architecture by saying that finding measure is something that happens inside architecture. My ambition, my purpose today is to prove, or at least to indicate, that architecture can be a medium to find measure way beyond architecture itself, to find measure in society and even in nature. So a last preliminary point is the word measure. I did some basic etymological research, and although most use of the word measure is quantitative and in a way very dry, there is an alternative interpretation possible of the word measure that relates to the let's say the long history of the word measure, coming from meter, coming from the Greek word metros, and coming from the Sanskrit word mita, which I think I indicated in the Sanskrit script in the final word on this slide. So there is a concept of measure that has to do with a very integrated, comprehensive assessment of the world that is full of quality, actually, not just quantity. And measuring things is a qualitative act. And in a way, this is a very important distinction, because if we start with the quantitative, with the meter or measure as something that only indicates how much space or any other category is between A and B, we tend to take the world very literally, where I try to take it very metaphorically. So I would suggest to take measure as something that is a metaphor, that creates a shift from an absolute distance to a relative distance, depending on the culture you find yourself in. So, for instance, if 1.5 meter social distance, as we observe it in the last year, in the wake of the pandemic, is something often to be conceived as something absolute, something that is clearly to be measured by tapes maybe, or by strong social rules in public life. You can also see that as a kind of invitation to reconceive our very ways of relating to each other, and to create a new rhythm of connections with the same concept of the meter or the measure, so to speak. And in a way, you could compare this with the word design, because also in design you see this distinction between people who take it very literally as something that is an object, and people who are able to see it as a verb, as an activity, as something that is never finished, as something that is an unended and open-ended activity, soliciting all kinds of interpretations at all times. And even the word architecture or architect also has this distinction between the literal description of the role of the person who claims the title architect, and the architect as a person who has a potential to prove through his or her very expertise and skills to create value, to create a world. In Greek, architect means, to some interpreters, the master builder, arche as master, tekton to build. But in an alternative interpretation, arche can also be seen as value, and tekton as the art of making. So the making of value creates a much more expanded interpretation of the role of architecture. And I believe that both in practice and in education, this this expanded notion can be much more helpful to embrace a larger mandate of architecture as an art. So I would like to present architecture as a medium, not just as a profession, as a medium to achieve something. So it's not only the output of architects, but actually a medium of humanity and our life as social beings. Of course, architecture can produce square meters, but it also can bring about, indicate, potentialize human connections, as this architect in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s proved so well in the wake of the Team 10 movement, Giancarlo De Carlo, here speaking at an event that I happened to organize at the University of Technology in Delft in 1987. So let's go back to the core of the problem that brings us to using these kind of heavy words like apocalypse. And maybe the most obvious and the most explicit and actually for most people most outrageous visualization of this situation is the way we are living in a state of excess. And whatever dimension you take, it can be world population, it can be urban population, it can be primary energy use, it can be international tourism, it can be the emission of carbon dioxide, it can be the terrestrial biosphere degradation, and so much more parameters that I could mention here. What becomes clear is that we are living in an age of great acceleration, and whatever parameter we take, these accelerations we can no longer ignore, let alone deny. We have to address it, we have to acknowledge and address it, and actually we have to deal with it as soon as possible, providing a sense of urgency to any conscious person and conscientious person who would like to do something about it. So this is obviously a way of thinking the urgency, the way of anticipating a possible apocalypse, so to speak, that is very important for us to define our agenda, to not only to be inspired by, because it's a kind of weird way to be inspired by, but certainly as something that will inform and fuel our actions with purpose. But it's far from the only thing that we need to act upon. There is another excessive situation which has to do with the global pyramid of wealth and the big gap between rich and poor, which is ever growing in a incredible, speedily way. And then finally, I think that in a third state of excess, you can also point at the rapidly expanded universe of artificial intelligence, where more and more capacity and faculties of the human intelligence are being outsourced to the digital technologies. So you could say with the acceleration as an issue, with the divide between rich and poor, and with the rapid takeover by artificial intelligence of basic human functions, there is a state of emergency of architecture that we need to address rapidly, and as I said, hopefully in the most radical way at schools, where there is the space, the room to maneuver, the margins for reflection, and the let's say the expectation of society around it to come up with new ideas to do something. So let me read you a story about finding measure by architecture. It may already be out of our hands, the fate of civilization and even our human destiny. Can we still salvage what is about to escape us? Is there still time to change course? By whatever means, we don't have much time left for reclaiming our agency. As we continue to borrow from the future, or in harsher words, to steal from the next generations, the thread of life is being stretched to a breaking point. Not long ago, talking about imminent collapse was ridiculed, I remember very well, as doomsdayism. Today, it's no less than a matter of fact. There is profound concern, as I just indicated, about indefensible global injustice. There is anxiety about the encroaching grip of algorithmic intelligence on our lives, and we are now really close to certainty about the planetary consequences of our worsening overshoot condition. We are now almost permanently exceeding our planet's ability to regenerate the essentials of life, climate, biodiversity, and natural resources. Clearly, our time is out of joint, and we are in dire need of balance before we sleepwalk into catastrophe. And to achieve balance, we need a strong sense of measure, clearly. Measure is the opposite of excess. It's a safeguard against abuse. In fact, knowing the right measure is the result of a prolonged effort to improve oneself. It is the key attribute, as well as the benefit, of character. For individuals, a sense of measure can express itself in many ways under the influence of different value systems. But, and that's the point here today, lecturing at an architecture school, if there's one overarching, comprehensive, and almost timeless modality of finding measure that all humanity can perfectly understand, it is architecture. The art of organizing our life in time and space measuredly. And some of the best designers from history knew this fact so very well that they almost identified their work with it. So why has architecture over the centuries merited this status as the embodiment of measure and balance, acquiring a reputation of being a metaphor of world order itself. It must be because there's no operation of the human mind that needs to factor in more parameters of life and that allows more human and natural dimensions to be part of the equation within the single synthetical act of creating and framing situations and events happening in our lives. It is the most all-encompassing medium for reconciling, combining, and synthesizing virtually everything that exists. Most importantly, perhaps, it galvanizes intention into result. Architecture, defined in this way, is clearly not just a profession delivering a service. It is the way humanity touches base with itself. That is why it has survived for thousands of years, and that is why, in its best manifestations, it has been the work of polymaths and boundlessly curious people who never stop seeking to understand more. As long as there are human beings and their challenges, there will be architecture. Therefore, architecture is obviously too important to leave to architects only. It is both our meter and our clock, and with our, I mean us as human beings. We measure our lives with architecture. From the toddler building a sandcastle at the beach, to the dying person's enjoyment of a ray of light coming through the window, we appreciate life with and through architecture. Good design makes you love life, and we can all be designers. If not in the making, then at least in the perception. So, how can architecture, as our profoundly human endeavor, help us to rediscover our sense of measure and battle excess and abuse? Surely, not by accepting what today is defined as architecture and by the people who claim it as their territory. On the contrary, architecture as the art of measure has been completely forgotten by a building practice that, despite some singular effects to counter it, is still largely adding to the ecological and moral overshoot. The same is true of its discourse which continues to overshadow common sense. On the contrary, current architectural practice privileges a frenzied production of new projects, new reputations, and new events restlessly crisscrossing the globe for opportunities to excel. It took a global pandemic to impose a quantitative limit. And what will take, or let's say, make this limit as a new quality in itself? So let me identify 3 out of several factors that has caused this slow loss of strength of architecture to do what I just advocated it could do. And if you go to my website, olebouwman.agency, you will find a couple of examples. One of them, the way architecture became identified with a personal story, with, let's say, a identity of the author as an expression of an individual, as something that has to do with a statement of a person rather than as the interpretation of a situation relevant for the people using it. Another example is how architecture fell victim to a very strong rhetoric, and how words became so important in the way architecture is presented and defended, and actually how architectural projects can be acquired, that words become more important than results or tangible output. And finally, and maybe also obviously for some, it's also the way architecture in many ways got overtaken by digital, by software, so to speak, by digital technologies, not only transforming architectural design into a cataloged process, but also in the way the architectural image becomes more and more rhetorical itself. So I cannot go into this more than this, but I think clearly architecture has drifted away from its true potential to be the medium of balance and measure of our existence. It has no, at this moment, has no incisive or decisive discourse, you could say, let alone a design for remedying injustice. It doesn't provide strategies to protect us from ubiquitous technology. And most existentially, as a general practice, it doesn't help us to cap global warming to the very much needed 1.5 centigrade global warming, not even the absolute necessary 2 centigrade. So architecture in the permanent overshoot mode has little to do with architecture as a profound human capacity to create balance. It speaks volumes not only about the predicament of architecture, but more so about the weakening agency of humanity itself to be its own guide and determine its own destiny. So in case you become a bit exhausted by this course of thought so far, let me make the counterpoint. Life is too short to waste on a lost cause, obviously. And the history of architecture is too rich to believe the present will forever determine its future. We had far better focus on all the potential for alternative scripts and keep striving for them. If the capacity for architecture is in deep trouble and the ideal medium for implementing it is not delivering, we can improve the latter and hope for its effects on the first. The most important thing is to reestablish the relationship between the two. How can architecture once again be measured, a measured response to a real need? And in my own work over the years, I've tried and tested several proposals and speculations to do so. And I would like to select a few here for the discourse of today. And all these examples are in a way transformations of an existing practice into something else. And by doing so, repositioning architecture as something closer to this productive and maybe even redemptive role that I'm talking about. So first case in point, pointing case is to see architecture as a way, as an answer that aspires to relevance and completely opening itself to society. And when I ran the Netherlands Architecture Institute in Rotterdam, this was exactly the main point of the agenda, to present this institution not as a territory of a profession, but actually as a source of inspiration, maybe even an engine of ideas for society to rely on architecture to solve its biggest problems. And as one specific example of the palette of activities that we developed, here is an app called Urban Augmented Reality, where we no longer relied on the premises of a building, hosting or where we could play our institutional life, but actually where you can put this institution in your pocket, and wherever you come in society, rely on the invisible brain of the collection, of an architectural collection, to find purpose, to become participant in a debate, to understand better what you see and what you run into when you play your public life, when you play your role in public life. A second example is the transformation of an existing professional magazine used to disseminate professional information and to revamp it, so to speak, as a manifesto of presenting architecture as a direct response, an embodiment of social dynamics. It was a wonderful time to present architecture as a medium to make a difference in society at large. So by emphasizing always the question of why is architecture doing this and why not doing something else, and by and with the result that everybody reading the magazine could constantly realize the hidden purpose, the hidden agenda of doing architecture. We try to bring architecture back to this very important node of the public debate. A third example was the establishment of a new studio, starting with a studio at an architectural school, MIT, in Boston, but then continuing with this studio later on, but not just any studio, but a studio for unsolicited architecture, a practice that is no longer waiting for a client to call, or a site to be occupied, or for a budget to be spent, or for a program to be materialized or to be spatialized, but actually to apply architectural intelligence to many other situations in society where there's not yet a client, there's not yet a site, but still a strong need for spatial and architectural intelligence. So in a way, you could say emphasizing an autonomous agenda for architecture to come to the scene, to pop up wherever it can be relevant, even without the formal settings of an architectural commission. And another example is the question, and this was very relevant in the wake of the credit crisis around 2009, 2010, the question how architecture can use this maybe even worst crisis in its living history to once again completely prove its point. So what it did was to take the lead in system change by addressing the urgent questions of our time, and so proving its indispensable qualities, something that no market clash can ever deny or suppress, its indispensable qualities and undeniable relevance through helping the world to drastically reduce overshoot. Here is the example, a project that we did for the Dutch pavilion at the Venice Biennale, where there was only one pavilion, as you know, but actually there is a potential to provide many different situations inside that same pavilion. So by applying a curtain system inside this little pavilion, we managed, I believe, to multiply that space many times, allowing it to adopt different functions depending on the setting of a curtain that was moving around inside that space. So with a very light intervention, this project could demonstrate that an existing piece of architecture, an existing application of natural resources, you can also say, or an existing investment can be multiplied according to need, according to time, according to moment, according to purpose, depending on the ingenuity of the architectural design. In this case, delivered by Petra Blaise, the interior designer and landscape designer from Amsterdam. And another example of this transformation, of transformative role of architecture is can be seen in this project, a way to recapture hidden value in an old derelict factory in Shenzhen, a former glass factory that was transformed into a value factory on the purpose of the Shenzhen Biennale, where I happen to be creative director. So where once glass was produced in massive quantities, starting here at the oven of the main factory production hall, we opened a completely new narrative and also reprogramming of this fantastic factory with amazing architectural features and presenting a strong narrative how existing value can be repositioned and play a role in completely alternative domains. From industry and mass production to culture and the essential creation of quality. And how polluted ground, once only a kind of foundation of numbers of production, can start to become a new piece of nature, highly fertile. And a final example is the establishment of Design Society itself. It was already mentioned in the introduction. A new institution in Shenzhen as well, where no longer design was presented as a set of objects to be exhibited and displayed in museum spaces, but actually a design was positioned as an activity across entire society. So Design Society, I always was fond to put the intonation at the right wording. It's not Design Society, but Design Society as the agenda being represented already by the name of the institution itself. In Chinese, it works the same way, 设计后联, design as an activity, as a verb, and 后联 as the world of connections being supported and coming into being by design. And here are some examples of the atmosphere of the activities of Design Society, engaging already with the very young to help them imagine an alternative way of creation, relying less on natural resources and relying more on human imagination. So I'm near the end of the speech. I would like to ask the final question: what do proposals like this reveal, in my opinion? Well, hopefully they show that architecture still has all the potential to regain its original meaning as a unique symbol of our human agency and as an instrument of providing measure in our life. Reconnecting with society, repurposing as a discipline, proving its power in actual projects, and becoming a creative and healing time machine for overcoming the present and finding alternative futures that help us not only to survive, but to live life to the full. And granted, there has been already a lot of projects, proposals that propagate the power of architecture in such a positive way, in words and exemplary results. I admit that. And most of these proposals, these pilots, are presented with the hope that they will be leveraged and scaled to a wider practice. But best practice may not be enough to make a real dent in this great acceleration, as I mentioned, dwarfing any good intention by its lethal direction. In seeking to rediscover our proper measure, it is more important to understand that if only we start to change the fundamentals of our society in order to reshape it and to make it sustainable for the long term, we will come to rely on architecture much more profoundly than as a set of pilot schemes and demonstrations. We can be inspired by examples, but we ultimately need to deal with necessity and turn the exceptions into the rule. We need a different architecture to lead system change. The most comprehensive human endeavor, as I said in the beginning, that can combine respect for nature with transcendental aspirations. And since time immemorial, it is the expression of our agency. Its wonders can be shared by everyone, not just architects. And as long as architecture can help us to measure, we won't succumb, nor to the climate collapse, nor to the cyber surrender. As such, architecture, I believe, is the safeguard of humanity. So my final statement is, to be on or not to be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ole. There are around about 350 people here in the audience, and so you have to imagine a loud applause coming from them. Thanks very much. I'd like to ask Prem to respond first.
Are you seeing my presentation? Oops.
Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Ole. Ola. That was good. But I'm going to come at it from something that has been bothering me in very recent times, specifically the last year or so, trying to overcome the way I've been educated within a Western philosophical tradition, which says that if you have a problem, you need to think about it. And therefore come up with a new philosophy, a new framework, a new proposal. And I have little to disagree with that. In fact, there's nothing in your talk that I disagree with. But the question one has to ask is it both necessary and sufficient? And the inadequacy I see in this is that because there's this focus on externalities like a philosophy or framework or proposal, the consciousness of first-person experience, particularly the tacit dimension, is excluded. And one has to ask what you lose by this. And second, how one implements this philosophy into practice, the relationship between theory and practice is a bit elusive. So that raises the question of what is the role that practice plays in the process. I would agree with you that measure is crucial, but I'll look at it a little differently, and I'll approach it from the perspective of art, particularly the fine arts. And we've tended to look at them as symbolic and aesthetic, and that has led to an interpretation of art as luxury, because interpreting symbol requires sophistication, typically structured in a discourse that works by the codes of a highly educated and privileged elite. And aesthetic is seen as something that's superfluous to function in contemporary times. As a result, art is placed in rarefied circles, in museums, galleries, where it is interpreted in academia and other high culture circles. Architecture has a schizophrenic existence because it also takes on function. So function occurs in the everyday world, but the interpretation of architecture still is in the rarefied circles of academia and elsewhere, and within the profession, which has actually developed a very self-referential way of talking about value in a way that they find difficult to speak to non-architects. Now, this notion of art and luxury I found contradicted the condition I was observing, especially in a country like India, that the societies who are most embedded in art were the ones whose struggle for survival is the most precarious. Rural societies, tribal societies, and even everyday utilitarian objects were also art objects. There was no sort of separation of utility and contemplation. And I puzzled over this, and some light was thrown by the British writer Jeanette Winterson, who said, "I'm puzzled by the question, what is your book about? It is about itself, because if I could put it in other words, I wouldn't have taken such care choosing the words I did use." And that made me think that actually what art offers is exactitude. It's a precision that resists the decay and entropy of everyday life. And it's how a person uses the art to take a measure of themselves. And these rural and tribal societies in India I was referring to don't dedicate their understanding of the cosmos to a specialist like a scientist. They have to understand it themselves, and they use their art to achieve that understanding. So they use the art to measure themselves. And that has a huge implication, because what it privileges is the consciousness and agency of the inhabiting subject. We tend to approach our problems as professionals from the viewpoint of the consciousness and agency of the architect. And since that subject is also understanding the roots in the universe, it involves also taking a measure of the world, especially the natural world. Now, on Ola's website, he very importantly raises the question of invisibility. And that's really tied to measure, because when you want to measure, you're concerned about what is visible and what is invisible. And I'll talk about three kinds of invisibility. That which is invisible because it is inherently intangible, and that means it's transcendental. That which is invisible because the worldview does not recognize it. And that which is invisible because it arises out of complexity. So let me address each of them. Intangibility. Louis Kahn said great architecture should start with the unmeasurable, go through measurable means while it is being designed, and should eventually be unmeasurable. So that raises the question, how do you know the unmeasurable, which is an oxymoron? You know, you have to know something, you need to measure it, right? So the problem with the intangible is that you can't define it. But what it is important to realize is that when you experience it, it is a very tangible reality. And all that, so much that is important in our life, love, wonder, beauty, joy, all these things we can't define, but we know them as reality within our first person consciousness. So one has to ask, how do you take this beyond the personal and subjective? And you have to realize that first person consciousness is embedded within social and natural networks. And it moves between second person validation. I know that what I feel is true when I see the resonance of it in another, how it is recognized by another. And third person reification, that is our intellectual accounts, etc. And it's actually the dialectical moves between these levels rather than privileging any one. If you stay just at the pole of first person consciousness, it becomes narcissistic. If you stay just within third person reification, it becomes abstract, which is difficult to practice. So we need this consciousness that is embedded within other realms of consciousness, what Morris Berman calls a participating consciousness, which is what traditional societies have. And we need to think about how we can bring that into today's world. How do we make it rigorous? And I'd also offer the guideline that Joseph Campbell, the scholar of myth, suggests, is that it's a mistake to think we are searching for the meaning of life. What we really seek is the rapture of being alive. And we feel it most when our creations echo that our innermost beings in the most profound way, which is what myths do. And he suggests we need to transfer this ability elsewhere. Then the question of recognition. We sometimes don't recognize things because of our conceptual frameworks. We are blinkered. So, for example, we don't recognize the impact of gender in urban space. And it might affect our notion of what's public and what's private. And there are women who feel so oppressively labeled within the home that they step into the public realm for privacy. Or in India here, we develop paradigms of urbanization which 50% or more of the population cannot afford. They have to exist outside the structure of master planning. Or we don't recognize ecology, and we've socialized nature to be an aesthetic spectacle, which we treat with wonder when we see it in the primal forest or the sunrise, but we cannot look at the shrub in our backyard with the same sense of wonder. And that's so this requirement to understand, to recognize, is something that alertness of recognition is something we need to acquire. And it needs to be continuous. It's not that you sort it out once and it's sorted forever, because things keep shifting and you have to always ask, what should I recognize? And for that, empathy is needed. The emotions are needed, which is why first-person consciousness, again, is so important. Can we talk about ethical obligations? Can we talk, for example, about morality without talking about love? And the third is complexity. As Michael Polanyi argued, culture, nature, all of these are polycentric systems. And he gives the metaphor of a spider's web. Our intellect might grasp just one strand of the web, but we don't realize that when we act on it, we redistribute tension throughout the entire web. And these kind of systems are non-linear. And we come to terms with them through emergence, which is the capacity of a system to acquire a fundamental property that did not exist in an earlier state of the system. And the natural world operates through emergence, but so does the social world. Friendships develop through emergence. We don't find friends by first constructing a philosophy of friendship. If we did that, we probably wouldn't have friends. So in this kind of notion, we have to privilege harmony over understanding. So all of this really raises, rather than proposals about what architecture should be, it traces protocols and structures of practice as what we should turn our attention to. I often say that we think too much about the practice of architecture, but not enough about the architecture of practice. And I'll just go over a few dimensions of it very quickly, because we don't have time. One is we have to realize that things move through conversation, not through the linear logic of reasoning. Complex systems also move through these dialectical, back and forth moves. The relationship between theory and practice is the same. It works most dynamically and productively when you're always in a space of theory critiquing practice, practice critiquing theory. We have tended to push them into separate spaces. When I sketch, it's a means of creating a conversation between an idea and me, and the sketch becomes a tangible representation by which I can have this conversation. So we need to start thinking about what kind of conversations we have within our practice and with whom. What we pursue is not understanding, but mastery. And this is something that is acquired very slowly. It's the way traditional craftsmen work. And mastery becomes personal. It has to come through very slow methods. And it's not rational, because it also involves the tacit movement of the body. It involves the muscle memory. It involves so many other things. And when a master, you take a musician who's a master and a musician who's also professionally trained, but is just good, not great. And the difference between the great and the good is actually in very subtle things that they break away into this realm. There's the subtle that is the most powerful. And we need to acquire this capability. We need to resolve a problem the profession has about the autonomy of architecture. On the one hand, we need our autonomy as a discipline that crafts and orders space. But how do we do it without being self-referential, which is the way we've done it so far? And one of the methodologies we've been trying in our practice is to say every project must connect what we call a proposition and a diagram. The diagram is the autonomy of architecture, it's the spatial order, the part A of the project. The proposition is not about architecture, it's about life, and it's an aspirational statement about life and the world which is relevant to the project. So we need to look at the connections between the two. We're always concerned with what does a project mean and how does it reflect my intentions, thinking that the meaning of our work is conveyed by the intentions of the architect. But actually what happens is there's a process that begins after we have finished the project and stepped away, where inhabitation, there's a culture of inhabitation, which then breeds memory, and memory breeds affection. So the work slowly absorbs meaning. So we are trained in the aesthetics of expression. We need to start thinking in the aesthetics of absorption and realize this is something that happens when we as architects are silent. Very few architects come to terms with this silence. And finally, the question of the practice as a place, rather than the practice as a means. Practice is a place that shelters all these things about mastery. And we are trying to look at our practice in terms of 4 components, that it has a series of players who are on their personal quests for mastery and purpose. And the players need not be restricted to the formally recognized members or employees of the practice. Then these players take actions, both individual and collective, and those actions are in design, in projects, in research, in critique. These actions leave traces in terms of the record, and the trace in terms of its exactitude as a thing in itself without need for commentary and explanation. And from these traces, we extract beacon values, because our philosophies, our values are really like beacons that we can't philosophize every moment that we act, but we act with spontaneity, with emotion, but every now and then we cast our eye to the beacon to see whether we are on course. So this has led me, this questioning has led me through a series of questions from moving from one to the other. When I graduated, and for many, many years of my career, I thought the primary question was, what is architecture? But then I moved to another question, which is, what is my practice? But now looking at the idea of conversations and looking at the fact that those conversations validate both me and the other, that the resonances we find are more important, I ask, who is my friend in my practice? And it's not that one question obliterates the other. All 3 questions are equally important. But this question provides a point of access from which I then define my practice. And through those structures and protocols, the architecture of my practice, I continuously cope with the question, what is architecture? And by putting all these 3 questions together, I recognize that I am a human before I am an architect. And that's something we tend to lose. A lot of our discussions about architecture and the problems tend to be within the ambit of our profession. We're all humans, and we have to come to terms with our emotions, our ethics, our morality, and that marks a point of entry into the profession. So to recover that.
Thanks, Prem. Ola, you have time to respond.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Prem Chandravakar, for the how could I say that, for a complementary statement. So I think lots of what you're saying is very relevant, and I take it as a not as a compliment, but as a complementary part of the discourse I try to open. Maybe shifting the focus from a philosophical stance to a more professional, or at least practical stance. And that's very important, because in the end, I assume that most of the people listening to these speeches are practitioners. And it's always important to keep considering what it means. So what it means to reflect on the largest themes if it comes to the daily business. And I think your way to carve out the role of an architect and the life of an architect and the way of thinking of an architect is really important and inspirational. But it's, I think, also complementary in the sense that I don't see yet how, or maybe I should just say, I would like to come back also to the agenda of the organizers of this lecture series. So you have chosen a title, which is, whether you like it or not, breathing urgency. Right? So it's either you take manifesto or you take apocalypse, but both terms do breathe, do resonate excessive urgency. And I took that extremely seriously in my speech. I think it's worth to be very serious about it, because if there is something really urgent, it's almost like a biological fact. If there's an incredible urgency that you have to face as an organism, and certainly as a human being, there is this idea of either you fight or you flight, fight or flight. Because an urgency it can only be felt as an urgency when there's a threat. And when there's a threat, our options can become limited. Our space to maneuver, our freedom, our free will can become limited. You can either do this or that. And what I try to do is to do this or that, or design architecture, right? As a third option. Fight or flight or architecture, in a way. I think taking your subject matter so seriously, there is this need to do so, to share this sense of urgency, to respond in the most direct and activist way, to allow a world to exist in which the values that Prem brought up can still be cherished, right? So after your sense of urgency and your actions, you act upon it, are successful, I hope and I assume that we can go back to joy and passion and quality and love, right? So that's why I think it's highly complementary, because I completely agree with the ultimate need for those positive values and not just focus on survival. I think ultimately life is more important than survival. Although, given the agenda, survival is now very high on the list to address first. But of course, it has a reason, and that is ultimately to keep enjoying the great sentiments, great feelings that we can call life.
Thanks, Solar. Prem?
Yes, I think we have to realize that urgency is tied to complex systems. And complex systems are inherently non-linear. So there's no relationship you can easily draw between input and output. And because of that, to persuade someone to act on, say, the climate change crisis of inequality and many of these things, you can't. These kind of systems face not a last mile problem; they face a first mile problem, because you can't use someone to change their behavior radically when you can't give them any assurance that if you make this change, that will result. I think to recognize that, and Complex systems, what you have to seek is harmony rather than understanding, and see how actions at a local scale can then become viral. And I think that virality is not possible without all the emotion and the passion and the commitment. And what I suggest is that the scale of focus shifts. One is you focus on what is immediately in front of you. In complex systems, they come through a focus more on immediate engagement rather than on grand design. I mean, we don't have to go into complexity theory. I could explain this. I have a blog piece called to Design So As to Sustain, which explains this in further detail. But you start with the immediate, and another thing I argue is that we should look at what we call the architecture of the background. Is that the preoccupation should shift from what architects try to do, which produce great symbols of what architecture should be, architecture with a capital A, and actually have this follow this value system of the architecture, the background, where the primary purpose is to earn the affection and respect of the context within which you practice, and use architecture as a means of doing that. And when I say context, I mean both the social and the natural context, and to demonstrate that earned respect through what you're doing. So, and I think that if we all focus on doing that, that is more into the system, and which will actually
Sorry, Prem, we've lost you. Hi. Prem, are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
So, can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay. So, I feel rather than the traditional means where we try and argue our way through, and we come up against non-linearity where we can't convince people because we can't draw sufficient links between cause and effect. It is better to work at a smaller scale and make that viral to scale upwards, and complex systems can change very rapidly with that.
I think.
Yes.
Hi. I'm receiving questions on the chat as well. With your permission, can I open some of the questions, and then we can revisit the discussion as we go ahead. Is that okay with both of you, considering the time that? Okay, thank you. So this is a question from Shravan, who is a second-year student. He says, this is to OLE. He says, towards the beginning of your talk, you mentioned how inescapable architecture is, as even children building sandcastles are interacting with architecture. Do you think this overwhelming presence of architecture stems from an urge we have as species to create and even leave an impression of ourselves that's more permanent than our own existence, whether it be art, monuments to kings and gods, and even simple acts like doodling on a classroom desk or playing with a piece of clay to make it into something familiar? That's the question for OLE.
Sounds like a big question. I hope I fully understood. I just used this example of a toddler building a sandcastle, or someone at the end of his or her life enjoying how a window can allow some sunlight come in a softened way. That at these extremes of life, there is already it's already clear to most people what architecture can do to enhance our experience and to express ourselves, but also to reach the highest levels of perception, so to speak. So architecture as a medium to come closer to what Prem just pointed out as the most important values of a purposeful life and a life well lived. And in that sense, I think that's what architecture carried on over the ages, something that has given its reputation as not only as the embodiment of those values, but also as a kind of metaphor for a world order in which these values are cherished. And I think this core idea of architecture doing more than only delivering a service, right? So that to just responding to a client's need or a social question, but actually to come close to what people believe in and why they feel connected. This is what architecture has given its importance, relevance, and respect throughout the ages. And I think many, as I speak to architectural students, still many of the students choose the discipline of architecture for that very reason. They don't want to become a successful service provider as soon as possible. They feel a certain ideal behind this discipline, and that's what I was referring to. But I would like to expand, if you allow me, a little bit also on what Prem said at the end about dynamic systems. I think what we are going through now is in a way different from any time before, in that we are approaching, as I mentioned, the overshoot day, right? So we are approaching a kind of natural limit of what our societies can do with our planet and can do with each other in the social dimension. And the fact that we are approaching these limits also is not only providing us with a sense of urgency, but it also simplifies, in a way, the question we can ask to architecture. So, and I think that's the problem for architectural practice today, that it in some way is not organized to really embrace this simplified question. So when it comes, for instance, to climate change or global heating, most architecture still responds on the level of a category A lead building, right? It's still about buildings. It's still about technology. It's still about responding to clients. It's still about the same business case for a building. But the building can be very ecological. It can be very green, right? But it's still a building. And maybe we don't need a new building. Maybe we need an old building repurposed. And maybe we don't need a building built with cement, but we need a building made of wood. So there are architectural solutions on the level of the global scale of the problem that cannot be responded by buildings. But if you think about the solutions, how to organize, how to go through energy transition, how to transform the way we use natural resources, the question of tourism, the question of transport, the question of fossil fuel depletions. All these questions can be answered by spatial solutions, but the spatial solutions cannot be organized on the level of the building. They have to be organized on the level of entire societies, on the level of the entire system, and that's why I try to connect architecture as a practice to the issue of system change.
All right. Ole, there's another question. This is by Reshma. She says, "What is the pedagogic response to the apocalyptic manifesto, or what can be?"
Well, I think that is a wonderful question for your new dean. And I think the dean has a little time to wait for all the interventions in the series of lectures and to collect the best ideas and to do something with it. I think the dean has a wonderful job this year.
Okay, another question that is again springing from the same thought. What then is the imagined role of the architect as a professional in the future as we come closer to the apocalypse?
Well, it's a bit easy escape answer, but I heard that you are planning to put the speech online later, and since I think the core argument in the lecture is about this very question, so it's not only about a sense of urgency, but also the reason why we feel this urgency. And you can call it apocalypse. You can call it, let's say, you can call it a few softer definitions of our predicament. But whatever your definition, what I try to do is to show architecture has some options, to show alternative potentials of spatial thinking and spatial intelligence. And that's what you can find probably if you view the speech one more time.
Prem, there's a question for you. As architecture students, how can we train ourselves to develop the alertness of recognition that you spoke about, that requires an empathetic engagement with architectural practice?
In a way, this is tied to the earlier question about the role of the architect. And there are several things that you do. One is you, as I said, first come to terms with what you are as a human being, that you have certain sacred capability and creativity within you, and you're also within a context that you have an ethical obligation to. So coming to terms with that. The second thing is bringing the role of criticism. And that's especially something that's lacking in the culture of architecture, Indian architecture. And for that, we have to realize that criticism is not about judgment. Criticism is being able to look at something and look through the surface appearance of it and uncover its ideology. And for that, you have to be your own critic. The first critic has to be yourself. So do that. And the third is the sort of repetitive act of practice, repetitive practice by which you acquire mastery. And this is a very patient and slow process. And I'll tell you a story that illustrates this. It's in an interview by the Hindustani vocalist Pushkar Lele, who after training for 15 years felt he'd reached a plateau and was not going beyond it. So he did what most people in his predicament would do. He changed his guru, his teacher, and he started training under Vijay Sardeshmukh. And thought the guru would give him the keys to this higher realm that he was seeking. But the guru pushed him down to absolute basics and said, for the next 6 months, you will just sing one note, sa, which is the first note in the scale. And he found that pedantic, but you have to listen to the guru. So he did it, and he said one day he sang the sa that the guru was listening for, and the guru smiled and he said he realized that till then he had never hit the exact center of a note before. Guru was and Kumar Guru is for that human ultimate. He learned one note, but even practice you an entire within that one note. It's very powerful. So I think you need to pursue them very patiently and very rigorously. Calls this sadhana, which is a rigorous practice. And a lot important in our can only be learned sadhana, not through intellectual reflection.
Sorry, Prem, your voice is breaking in between. Yeah.
I don't know at what point you lost me.
We lost you when you were explaining the last bit of the sadhana.
I said sadhana is a repetitive, ego-transcending, rigorous practice. And you keep repeating it, and in that repetition, eventually an epiphany occurs. But you have to be patient, and to acquire that patience, you need a good teacher, because the teacher is not just guiding you in the protocols of practice by which you do it, but is also symbolizing the light at the end of the tunnel. You need to work with someone who is also pursuing mastery, who's been further down that road than you. So these are things that you need to do, and just come to terms with your own self, and realize the extent to which what you have been conditioned into sometimes even affects the way that you hold your body. There's a wonderful film that I saw about a dance workshop that was held in a Spanish high school, and a lot of the kids had got into sort of roles that they wanted to play: the victim, the bully, the nerd, the cool guy, and that had conditioned their body. And once they started dancing, acquiring the skill to dance, they started questioning their roles that they had slotted themselves into. So start just learning to be free, to move freely.
Prem, there's one more question for you. In your argument, you valorize the immediate, citing tribal art versus dealing with uncontrollable, unimaginable complexity. Are you, by extension, implying that tribal art, tribal existence, does not intimately deal with complexity and the uncontrollable?
No, I cited tribal art just to cite an example of a community whose struggle for survival is most precarious, but is still highly embedded in art. So even a knife or a coconut scraper or a rice measure, all of these are also made into art objects. They're not just treated as utilitarian objects. And they do that because they have to make sense of their world through their art. Whereas we tend to treat art as a luxury, and we don't look at it as this sort of really embedded means of taking a measure of ourselves. So that's not why I cited tribal art, saying that they are better at dealing with complexity, or they don't deal with complexity. The complexity argument was one that was saying that we have to recognize non-linearity and therefore move with the principles of how emergence occurs.
Thank you. I'm going to take one more question here. At the wake of current pandemic, which has provoked tremendous questions and conversations in the field of architecture, how young, soon-to-be architects like us can place ourselves in practice for the next decades to come? And this is a question for both of you. Ola?
I think you're muted. Your mic is muted.
Can you summarize the question?
I'll do it again. At the wake of current pandemic, which has provoked tremendous questions and conversations in the field of architecture, how young, soon-to-be architects like us can place ourselves in practice for the next decades to come?
Yeah, I think there's a huge conversation going globally about the impact of the pandemic on architectural practice, either in terms of job opportunity, or in terms of mandate, or in terms of subject matter, or in terms of the substance of the very discipline. So some architects, for instance, in my own country, the Netherlands, they are adamant to deny any role for architects to react to the pandemic, which, as they believe, is in essence something temporary, something ephemeral. And architecture is way too slow to respond to such ephemeral issue. But of course, there are also people referring to the inspiration that comes from considering distance such an important part of the fight against the pandemic, the awareness of distance and the 1.5 meter rule as an architectural concept. So intrinsically important for architects to consider. Or they say a zoonotic epidemic can easily happen again. So we better prepare ourselves for more pandemics in the future. These kind of arguments. And these people, they believe that we have to rethink distance and the way we relate to each other as something that architects have a great tradition in to consider and reflect upon, and they should intensify that. So I think both positions are valid. Architecture is slow, and maybe next year we have a completely different situation. But if we believe the scientists, we can come back to this situation sooner than we hope. And if that is true, and even if it's not true, just for the sake of architecture reflection, I think it really would be good to invest more time, invest more brain power in considering the way we relate to each other in public space. It was already a big question, how we relate to each other in public space and how we can design the relationships in public space and how can we create an alternative choreography of our public behavior, not something that is only about avoiding each other, trying to go around each other, but as alternative ways to relate, as alternative ways to communicate in space and by spatial concepts. So I think there is plenty of reason to be inspired by what is now a predicament, but can actually become an interesting impulse for architectural design, just as it was in previous situations where tuberculosis or the flu were also having great impact on architectural design. And there are even people saying that the modern movement could not have happened in the same intensity and with the same success if there was not a Spanish flu pandemic in 1918, 1919.
Prem?
Yeah, I would say that the pandemic is forcing us to look at many things that we could choose not to look at. So just to name a few, one is the current neoliberal thinking that it is markets that are most efficient and government is inherently inefficient. And the pandemic has revealed that markets design for efficiency and not resilience. And it requires a different kind of thinking to design for resilience. So we have this rather weird situation of people who had been encouraging privatization, saying government is inefficient, are now desperately calling for assistance from the government, which they had dismissed as inefficient. So this whole notion of what public interest is something that we need to think of. We need to critique how projects are created by this neoliberal paradigm, the projects that architects are being asked to do right now. The second thing is it has rendered certain people visible, like the migrants suddenly, who people chose not to see in the city and perhaps are not even aware that they were there. Suddenly the policymakers acted as though they didn't know they were there. And so suddenly to realize that your welfare is tied to their welfare in sort of very complex chains. I mean, like a virus does not know boundaries of class and caste, right? So you realize that you need to look at the resilience and equity of the system. So you need to look at things like that. You need to look at what is considered a healthy environment. That's a question that architects need to be asking. And again, because of our paradigms of both agribusiness and urbanization, we are increasing the likelihood of zoonotic viruses. And so, as Ola mentioned, I'd like to end by saying that we really need to think of what the future is, and this has a specific acuity in the Indian context, where we right now have something like 460 colleges of architecture, churning out something like 20,000 architects a year, architecture graduates a year. The current number of registered architects with the Council of Architecture is about 120,000 across the country. And this is registered architects, so the number of firms will be much smaller. So obviously, architecture practice as it is currently defined does not create a market where these 20,000 graduates a year are going to find employment, let alone the internships that they need to do to get their degree. So I think the young constituency needs to sort of address this question with some urgency, because change will not happen that fast, but they need to sort of raise demands on the system. And part of the critique and the sort of new thinking has to be alternative modes of practice, like the kind that Ola mentioned in his lecture. We'll have to start thinking about those, because the traditional paradigm of practice is just not going to provide sufficient opportunity for all.
Thanks, Prem. Ola, we'll end with one last question for you, if it's okay. Should we then be asking how to measure and direct? Should we then be asking how to measure and direct academics and practices to bring balance between man and nature? Should we then be seeking on how to learn and hybridize the diverse discourses? That's the question.
About hybridize?
Yeah, hybridize the diverse discourses to seek the relationship between man and nature. Balance.
Well, I always hope that the hybridization of discourse is something that can be achieved within faculties of architecture, rather than let everyone do what they think is the core, and then only have a kind of intermediate program or overarching program to make the connections. I think architecture in itself is a very hybrid practice, and already inside architectural pedagogy, this hybridization can take place, and actually should take place. Otherwise, it can never be felt from within that architecture can have this mandate to bridge the gap between man and nature, and between many other extremes, or let's say opposites, in society. So if we don't hybridize architecture itself, it remains underserving or not fully matching its potential as it could have.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to close the questions. Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Prem. Thanks for the engaging discussion. I'm going to we'll end in another 5 minutes. I'm going to ask Ainsley Lewis to come and announce the shortlisted entries of the colloquium that has been put up. He's going to do that, and then we'll be ending with a thank you note. Ainsley?
Yeah. Yep. Can you hear me, Shirish?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Yes. Okay. So after that great engaging lectures and fantastic discussion, I have the privilege to announce the shortlisted entries. It's a choice between the jurors who has actually viewed all the projects in the exhibition, and also the students who actually did a Google kind of sheet and sent in the kind of final results. We have actually put the entries together based on larger themes, based on the keywords which were there with each of the abstracts. So the thing is that I'm going to, there's no particular order of merit, but the number of projects are actually put in various themes for tomorrow's presentation. Tomorrow, the first session, we have a project code A01, a connect between city and the river, Harsh Shah. The second project would be A10, Peri-urbanism, addressing the politics of in-between, Nikita Kulkarni. After that, we'll have the next session where you have B13, reconceptualizing the food web, Prachi Shah. A02, RA X City, Suraj Torat. The fifth project is B14, rendering visibility urban waste manufacturer in Mumbai, Saloni Kapoor. The next day's session, 13th of March, you have A06, idol making for Ganpati Utsav in Mumbai, Rohit Kodale. The next project, the seventh project, B10, Living Heritage Chanderi, Sangyukta Rajiv. The last session for the colloquium, you have three projects. C04, exhuming Navayan assertion, architecture against counter-revolution, Ajinkya Dekne. And the next ninth project, C07, hate spaces, ghettos, a city within the city, Anandita. And the 10th project, B17, the paradox of recognition, a case of the Hijra community in Malwani, Shreya Bansal. So these are the 10 shortlisted projects done by the students and the jurors. All these projects will now be exhibited tomorrow when in the colloquium exhibition, which will be launched tomorrow online. Yeah. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Ainsley. Aishwarya, can you do the closing remarks, please?
Thank you, Shirish. So, first and foremost, I would like to thank our speakers for today, Mr. Ola Berman and Mr. Prem Chandavarkar, to have presented to us their perspective and brought out insightful thoughts and trajectories that may shape this discourse further. I would like to thank the Kamala Raheja Foundation for their significant and continual support, which has always helped the KRMLS thrive and develop. The KRVIA administration team, the faculty body, as well as the student body, have been instrumental in setting up this event and require a special appreciation. This event wouldn't have been possible without the efforts of the KRMLS team, who have worked relentlessly to make this event possible despite the challenges posed by the ongoing pandemic. Last but not the least, I would like to thank each one of you present here today. Do note that the event shall be carried forward over the next 2 days, and we hope to see you all again. Have a lovely evening.
Thank you. Thanks, Prem. Thanks, Ola. Bye. See you guys soon. See you guys soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good luck with the
Thanks a
remaining.
lot. Bye.
We'll keep in touch with both of you.
Thank you, Ola. Thank you, Prem. We'll be in touch as far as this manifesto is concerned, see how it turns out. Lots of good pointers for us to take forward and struggles as well.
Yeah.
All right. Bye.
Bye.
Good luck.
Thank you.